Montana Territory, 1871. The late autumn wind howled across the rolling plains, carrying the promise of another merciless winter. Nathan Vance pulled his worn leather coat tighter around his broad shoulders as he guided his horse through the gathering twilight. At 25, he had already seen enough of the frontier's cruelty to believe that the West was no place for tenderness. Life here was about survival, nothing more. His ranch, the Broken Arrow, lay 5 miles ahead, a modest spread with a small herd of cattle and a cabin he'd built with his own hands. 3 years he'd worked that land alone, speaking more to his horses than to any human soul. Nathan had convinced himself that's how he preferred it. The war had left him with scars both visible and hidden, and he'd come to believe that solitude was safer than connection. Everyone he'd ever loved had been taken by violence or disease. The frontier, he'd decided, demanded isolation as the price for survival. The first snowflakes began to fall as he spotted smoke rising from a chimney where no chimney should be. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip as he approached the abandoned Miller homestead. The family who'd built it had fled back east after 2 brutal winters and a Sioux raid that took their livestock. No one should be there now. Nathan dismounted carefully, tying his horse to a post before approaching with cautious steps. Through the window, he could see the warm glow of a fire and a slender figure moving about. Drawing his revolver, he pushed open the door with his free hand. "Who's there?" he called, his voice rough from disuse. The woman spun around, a kitchen knife clutched in her trembling hand. She was young, no more than 20, with golden blonde hair tumbling in waves past her shoulders. Her blue calico dress was worn but clean, and her eyes, wide with fear, were the deep blue of a summer sky. Despite the knife, she looked more frightened than dangerous. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking, "I have nowhere else to go." Nathan lowered his gun slowly but didn't holster it. "This isn't your property." "I know," she swallowed hard. "I was traveling with a wagon train to Oregon when I fell ill. By the time I recovered, they'd gone on without me. The family in Helena who nursed me back to health said this place was abandoned." Something in her story didn't quite fit, but the snow was coming down harder now and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Nathan had seen what Montana winters did to the unprepared. "What's your name?" he asked, finally sliding his revolver back into its holster. Dahlia Vickers." She lowered the knife, placing it on the rough-hewn table beside her. "And you?" "Nathan Vance. I own the ranch 5 miles east." He moved closer to the fire, drawn by its warmth. "You can't stay here alone." Her chin lifted slightly. "I've managed for 2 weeks already." 2 weeks in autumn isn't the same as surviving a Montana winter. He looked around the cabin, noting the meager supplies. "You have enough food for maybe another week, not nearly enough firewood. And the first real storm is coming tonight." Dahlia's shoulders slumped slightly. "I'll find a way." "No," Nathan said flatly, "you won't, not alone." He hadn't planned to say what came next. It violated every rule he'd set for himself since staking his claim in this harsh territory. "Gather your things. You'll stay at my ranch until spring, when the wagons come through again." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "And what will this hospitality cost me?" The question stung, though he understood its necessity. Women alone on the frontier had reason to be wary. "Nothing that isn't freely given," he answered. "I have a separate room. You'll be safe." "I give you my word." As she hesitated, the wind howled louder, rattling the cabin's shutters. "I can't survive another winter alone," Dahlia whispered, the desperation in her voice unmistakable. Nathan reached for her hand. "You won't have to." The first week at the Broken Arrow passed in awkward silence. Nathan went about his chores, tending to the cattle and horses, chopping wood, and hunting when weather permitted. Dahlia took over the cooking and cleaning without being asked, establishing an unspoken arrangement that kept them in separate orbits except at mealtimes. During those shared meals, Nathan found himself studying her when she wasn't looking. There was something graceful about the way she moved, something resilient in her posture that spoke of hardships endured. She was beautiful, undeniably so, but it was the mystery behind her eyes that drew his curiosity. She spoke little of her past, claiming to be an orphan from Philadelphia who decided to seek a new life in Oregon. On the 8th evening, as a blizzard raged outside, Nathan returned from the barn to find Dahlia standing at the window, staring into the swirling whiteness with tears streaming down her face. "Are you all right?" he asked, the words feeling clumsy on his tongue. She quickly wiped her cheeks with her apron. "Just foolish thoughts." Nathan hung his coat and moved to the fireplace, warming his hands. Nothing foolish about finding the winters hard, even those born to it struggle. Dahlia turned to face him. It's not the winter exactly, it's, she paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. Today would have been my father's birthday. First one since he passed. It was more personal information than she'd offered since arriving. Nathan nodded, unsure how to respond. I used to bake him a special cake, she continued, her voice soft with memory. With blackberries we'd pick together in summer. I'm sorry, Nathan said, meaning it. Losing family, it stays with you. You've lost someone too, it wasn't a question. Nathan stared into the flames. Everyone, eventually. Parents to cholera when I was 16. Brother at Gettysburg. Wife and infant daughter to childbed fever 3 years ago. The words hung in the air between them. He hadn't spoken of Sarah and little Emma to anyone since burying them in Kansas before heading west. Dahlia moved closer, her presence unexpectedly comforting. That's why you're out here alone. Seemed safer that way. He looked up to find her watching him intently. Can't lose what you don't have. Is that truly living, though? She asked. The question followed Nathan into his dreams that night, echoing in the howling wind. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and something between them began to thaw. Nathan found reasons to remain in the cabin during the day, mending tack, carving a new chair, anything to occupy his hands while sharing space with Dahlia. For her part, she began asking questions about ranch life, expressing genuine interest in learning. One morning after a week of heavy snow had kept them housebound, Nathan was surprised to find her dressed in trousers and one of his old shirts. Teach me to ride, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. If I'm to survive out here, I need to know how. In this weather, Nathan raised an eyebrow. The snow's stopped and the sun's out, and I'm going mad being cooped up in here. Her blue eyes challenged him. Unless you don't think I can manage it. That afternoon found them in the corral with Penny, Nathan's gentlest mare. Dahlia listened attentively to his instructions, her determination evident in the set of her jaw. When he placed his hands on her waist to help her mount, something electric passed between them, a current that left his heart racing. You're a natural, he said as she guided the horse in a careful circle, her blonde hair gleaming in the winter sunlight. Her laughter, bright and unburdened, caught him off guard. It was the first time he'd heard it, and the sound unlocked something within him, a door he'd believed permanently sealed. The riding lessons continued whenever weather permitted, becoming the highlight of Nathan's days. Dahlia proved a quick study, fearless and eager to learn. Soon she was accompanying him on short rides to check fence lines and cattle, their conversations flowing more easily on horseback than within the cabin's confining walls. Why cattle ranching? She asked one clear December afternoon as they rode along the creek that bordered his property. Nathan considered the question. Freedom, I suppose. After the war, I couldn't stand being hemmed in by people and their expectations. Out here, a man answers only to himself and the land. And the weather, Dahlia added with a smile, and the market prices. And the cattle themselves. He chuckled, fair enough, maybe not complete freedom but a different kind of belonging. The land becomes part of you after a while. I can see that, she said softly, looking out across the snow-covered expanse. There's an honesty to it. The frontier doesn't pretend to be gentle, but there's beauty in its harshness. Nathan studied her profile, struck by how perfectly she'd articulated what he'd always felt but never expressed. Exactly so. That night, as they sat before the fire, Nathan found himself telling Dahlia about his dreams for the ranch, expanding the herd, building a proper house to replace the cabin, perhaps planting an orchard come spring. She listened intently, offering suggestions that revealed a practical mind and a vision that complemented his own. When he finally fell silent, realizing how much he'd spoken, Dahlia smiled. You're planning for a future. That's good. Been a while since I've done that, he admitted. She held his gaze. Maybe it's time. Christmas arrived with a break in the weather. Nathan rose before dawn and saddled his horse, leaving Dahlia sleeping. He returned mid-morning with pine boughs, bright red berries, and a small package wrapped in brown paper. Dahlia looked up from kneading bread dough, her eyes widening at the greenery. What's all this? Christmas decorations. He laid the boughs on the table. My mother never let a holiday pass without some celebration, no matter how hard times were. Together they arranged the pine boughs and berries around the cabin. Nathan watched as Dahlia hummed carols while working, her cheeks flushed with pleasure at the simple decorations. She'd made cinnamon cookies as a surprise, and the cabin filled with their spicy aroma. After their Christmas supper, Nathan handed her the small package. It isn't much. Dahlia unwrapped it carefully to reveal a carved wooden horse, its lines elegant and flowing. Nathan, she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth surface. It's beautiful. Thought you might like a reminder of your riding lessons, he said, suddenly self-conscious. When spring comes and you head west again. Something flickered across her face, uncertainty perhaps, or something deeper he couldn't name. I have something for you too, she said, retrieving a package from beside her bed. Inside, Nathan found a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool. When did you make this? While you were out with the cattle. I've been unraveling and reknitting an old shawl, she smiled shyly, to keep you warm on those dawn rides. He wrapped it around his neck, touched by the gift and the thought behind it. Thank you, Dahlia. That night, as snow began falling once more, they sat side by side before the fire, the distance between them diminishing with each shared story, each quiet laugh. When Dahlia finally rose to retire to her room, she paused beside his chair. Merry Christmas, Nathan, she said softly, and before he could respond, she bent and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. The spot burned warm long after she'd gone, like a brand upon his skin. January brought a cold snap that froze everything solid. The cattle huddled in the lee of the barn, and ice formed on the water troughs faster than Nathan could break it. On the third brutally cold morning, he returned from tending the animals to find Dahlia pale and shivering despite the roaring fire. Just a chill, she insisted, but by nightfall her skin burned with fever. Panic seized Nathan as he bathed her forehead with cool cloths. The nearest doctor was in Helena, 30 miles away through snow-choked passes. He'd seen enough frontier illness to know how quickly it could claim a life. For 3 days and nights, he barely left her side, coaxing water and broth between her cracked lips, praying to a god he'd long since stopped believing in. He spoke to her continuously, telling stories of his childhood, describing the ranch in spring, making promises about the future, anything to keep her tethered to the world. On the fourth morning, her fever broke. Nathan, dozing in a chair beside her bed, woke to find her watching him, her blue eyes clear once more. You're still here, she whispered. He took her hand, his voice rough with exhaustion and relief. Where else would I be? She fell back to sleep, her fingers intertwined with his. As Dahlia recovered her strength, something fundamental shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained dissolved, replaced by a comfortable intimacy born of crisis weathered together. Their hands found reasons to touch, passing a plate, adjusting a saddle, reaching for the same book. Their conversations stretched late into the night, covering everything from childhood dreams to philosophical debates about man's place in the wilderness. Nathan found himself reimagining his future, not as a solitary endeavor but as something shared. The thought terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. February arrived with another blizzard that kept them cabin-bound for days. On the third evening, restless with confinement, Dahlia suggested they clear the furniture to one side of the main room. What for? Nathan asked, though he was already helping her move the table. Dancing, she replied, eyes twinkling. Every proper Eastern lady knows how to dance. It's high time you learned. I know how to dance, he protested, just been a while. She positioned herself before him, one hand extended. Show me then. Without music, Dahlia hummed a waltz as she guided him through the steps. His initial awkwardness faded as they moved together across the rough plank floor, the lamplight casting their shadows large against the walls. When she stumbled slightly, his arm tightened around her waist, drawing her closer than propriety allowed. Neither moved to restore the proper distance. Where did you learn to dance so well? He asked, voice low. Orphan girls from Philadelphia don't usually receive such training. Something flashed in her eyes, guilt perhaps or fear. She stepped back abruptly. You're right, they don't. Dahlia. I should check on the stew, she said, turning away. That night, Nathan lay awake long after the cabin fell silent, turning their conversation over in his mind. Dahlia Vickers was keeping secrets, that much was clear. The question was whether those secrets mattered against what he'd come to feel for her. The mid-February thaw brought unexpected visitors. Nathan was mending fence when he spotted 3 riders approaching from the east. He signaled to Dahlia, who was exercising her horse nearby, and they both returned to the cabin. Stay inside, he told her, checking his revolver before stepping onto the porch. The men reined in at a respectful distance. The leader, a weathered man in his 40s, removed his hat. Afternoon, I'm Marshal James Thornton from Helena. These are my deputies. Nathan nodded cautiously. Nathan Vance, what brings the law to Broken Arrow? Looking for someone. The marshal's gaze moved to the cabin door, where Dahlia now stood despite Nathan's instruction. We've had word a woman might be hiding in these parts. Dahlia Vickers. Also goes by Dahlia Valmont. Nathan felt Dahlia stiffen beside him, what she wanted for. Theft, the marshal said flatly. Stole $5,000 from her stepfather in St. Louis before fleeing west. He's offering a substantial reward. Lies, Dahlia said, her voice steady despite her pallor, every word of it. Marshal Thornton studied her carefully. You're her, then. Nathan moved slightly, positioning himself between Dahlia and the lawman. Whatever you're after, you won't find it here. Step aside, Vance, one of the deputies said, his hand hovering near his gun. This isn't your concern. She's under my protection, Nathan replied, his voice hardened by years of frontier survival. That makes it my concern. Dahlia placed a hand on his arm. Nathan, please, I don't want trouble for you. The marshal dismounted, approaching slowly with his palms visible. Miss Vickers, I'm just doing my job. If you come peacefully, we can sort this out in Helena. And if I tell you George Valmont is a liar and a thief himself, that the money was my inheritance from my mother, which he stole from me. Dahlia's voice rose with indignation. Will you sort that out too, Marshal? Thornton frowned. That's for a judge to decide. And how many judges in Montana territory take a woman's word over a wealthy man's? Nathan asked quietly. Especially when there's reward money involved. Tension stretched between them, taut as a wire. Finally the marshal sighed. I have no official warrant yet, just instructions to locate her. He fixed Dahlia with a stern look. But it's coming, miss, and when it does, neither your story nor your protector here will stop me from doing my duty. Understood, Nathan said before Dahlia could respond. Now, unless you have that warrant in your pocket, I'd appreciate it if you'd ride on. Daylight's wasting and we've stock to tend. The lawmen departed with obvious reluctance, the marshal leaving a clear warning that he'd return. When they disappeared beyond the ridge, Nathan turned to Dahlia, whose composure had finally cracked. I should have told you, she whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. Yes, Nathan agreed, his voice gentle despite his confusion. You should have. Inside, with a cup of strong coffee warming her hands, Dahlia revealed the truth she'd hidden. She was indeed Dahlia Vickers, but also Dahlia Valmont by her mother's second marriage. Her mother had died the previous spring, leaving Dahlia a modest inheritance, enough to start fresh somewhere far from her controlling stepfather. George claimed my mother had changed her will, leaving everything to him, she explained, anger and grief mingling in her voice. But I'd seen the true will only weeks before. When I confronted him, he threatened to have me committed to an asylum. So you took what was rightfully yours and ran, Nathan finished for her. Dahlia nodded. I paid a clerk at the bank to help me. We'd been childhood friends and he knew what George was like. Her fingers tightened around her cup. I never intended to deceive you, Nathan. At first I didn't know if I could trust you. And then. Her eyes met his, vulnerable yet determined. And then I feared losing what we'd found here. Nathan reached across the table, covering her hand with his. You won't lose it. Not because of this. The relief on her face was painful to witness. The marshal will return. Yes, he agreed, and we'll be ready. The following week brought lengthening days and signs of approaching spring. The snow began retreating, revealing muddy ground beneath. Nathan increased his vigilance, always keeping a rifle nearby as he worked. Dahlia refused to be confined to the cabin, insisting on continuing their normal routine despite the threat hanging over them. I won't live in fear, she said firmly. I've done enough of that already. Nathan admired her courage even as it concerned him. Each day without the marshal's return only increased his anxiety. The waiting gnawed at him worse than any direct confrontation. On a clear morning in early March, Nathan rode out to check the north pasture where the earliest grass would appear. He'd been reluctant to leave Dahlia alone, but she had insisted, pointing out that they couldn't put life on hold indefinitely. He was halfway back to the ranch when he saw the smoke, too much for a cooking fire, rising thick and black against the blue sky. Nathan spurred his horse to a gallop, heart pounding with dread. As he crested the final rise, he saw the barn engulfed in flames, the cattle scattered and panicked. Of Dahlia and the cabin there was no sign, Drawing his revolver, he approached cautiously, scanning for movement. A shot rang out, the bullet kicking up dirt near his horse's hooves. "That's close enough, Vance," a voice called from behind a corral post, not the marshal's voice someone knew. Nathan dismounted, using his horse for cover.
Where is she?
A man emerged from behind the corral, lean and hard-eyed, with a star pinned to his vest, not one of the deputies who'd accompanied Thornton. "Your thieving woman, she's where she belongs, heading back to St.
Louis to face justice."
Cold fury washed over Nathan, Marshal Thornton. The deputy smirked, "Had urgent business in Butte, left me to serve the warrant." He gestured toward the burning barn with his revolver. "Shame about your property," girl put up quite a fight. "Is she hurt?" Nathan demanded, his voice deadly quiet. "Nothing serious," the man shrugged. "Few bruises, maybe." "Nothing her kind hasn't earned." Nathan's finger tightened on the trigger, but he forced himself to think clearly. Killing a lawman, corrupt or not, would only ensure he'd never reach Dahlia. When did they leave? "Couple hours back," the deputy waved his gun toward the east, taking the Helena Road. Nathan calculated quickly. If they'd left 2 hours ago, he might still catch them before they reached town. You're within your rights to arrest her if you have a proper warrant. Burning a man's barn is another matter. "Accident," the deputy claimed with false innocence. "Lantern got knocked over during the struggle." "Then you won't mind coming with me to explain that to Marshal Thornton," Nathan suggested, his revolver steady. "We can all sort this out together in Helena." The deputy's expression hardened. "I don't think so, rancher. You're interfering with the law. That's a hanging offense in these parts." He raised his gun, but Nathan was faster. His shot caught the deputy in the shoulder, spinning him backward. The man's revolver discharged harmlessly into the ground as he fell. Nathan crossed the distance between them swiftly, kicking the fallen weapon away. The deputy clutched his bleeding shoulder, cursing viciously. "Where exactly are they taking her?" Nathan demanded, his revolver aimed at the man's head. "Go to hell," the deputy spat. Nathan crouched beside him, voice dangerously soft. "You've got two choices. Tell me everything, who you're really working for, where they're taking her, or bleed out here alone while I go find her anyway." Fear flickered in the man's eyes. "Not a real deputy," he admitted through gritted teeth. "Valmont hired us. Paid the marshal to look the other way."
Was?
"Two others taking her to meet Valmont's man in Helena, Blackwater Saloon." Nathan tore a strip from the man's shirt, binding his wounded shoulder tightly enough to stop the bleeding. "That should keep you alive until I get back." He searched the man efficiently, finding a folded paper in his vest pocket, the supposed warrant, crudely forged. 15 minutes later, Nathan galloped eastward, a spare horse trailing behind him, his rifle and extra ammunition secured to his saddle. The deputy, tied securely to a post outside the burning barn, shouted obscenities that faded into the distance. Nathan rode hard, pushing his horse to its limits. The Helena Road wound through rolling hills and narrow canyons, deal terrain for an ambush, but also offering plenty of places where a small party might stop to rest. He slowed only when necessary to check for tracks, finding fresh hoof prints that confirmed he was on the right trail. As twilight approached, he spotted smoke from a small campfire in a sheltered draw just off the main road. Nathan dismounted, secured his horses, and approached on foot, moving silently through the gathering shadows. 3 horses were hobbled near the fire. Dahlia sat on a fallen log, her hands bound before her, while 2 men argued quietly several paces away. Even in the dim light, Nathan could see a darkening bruise on her cheekbone. Rage threatened to overwhelm his judgment. Nathan forced himself to breathe slowly, to think. A frontal assault would put Dahlia in danger. He needed a diversion. Moving carefully back to his horses, he removed his spare revolver from his saddlebag and a handful of cartridges. Then he circled wide around the camp, coming up on the opposite side from where he'd left his mounts. The dry branch he threw landed in the fire with a shower of sparks. As both men turned instinctively toward the sound, Nathan fired a shot into the air from his position. The men drew their weapons, scanning the darkness. "Jenkins," one called, "that you?" Nathan fired again from a slightly different position. The confusion was enough. One man moved away from the fire, heading toward the sound, while the other remained near Dahlia. Nathan circled silently back, approaching the camp from behind the log where Dahlia sat. He placed his spare revolver on the ground near her bound hands, then whispered, "When I create an opening, run for the horses." Her slight nod was the only indication she'd heard him. The man who'd remained by the fire was growing nervous. "Sutton," he called into the darkness, "what's happening out there?" Nathan's answer was a shot that shattered the coffee pot near the fire. As the man dove for cover, Dahlia snatched up the revolver with her bound hands. Nathan broke cover, firing twice more to keep the man pinned down. "Run," he shouted to Dahlia, who was already moving toward the trail where he'd indicated. The second man, Sutton, came crashing back through the underbrush, firing wildly. A bullet grazed Nathan's arm, but he barely felt it. He returned fire methodically, dropping Sutton with a shot to the leg. The first man was recovering, raising his weapon toward Nathan's back. Dahlia, halfway to safety, turned and fired. Her shot went wide, but it was enough to distract the man, giving Nathan the moment he needed to swing around and fire. The man crumpled, his gun unfired. Silence fell, broken only by Sutton's groans and the crackling fire. Dahlia stood frozen, the revolver still clutched in her bound hands. Nathan moved quickly to her side, using his knife to cut her bindings. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, eyes scanning her for injuries beyond the bruise on her face. She shook her head, shock giving way to relief as she recognized him fully. "Nathan," she breathed, collapsing against his chest. "I thought when they took me." "I know," he murmured into her hair, holding her tightly. "I know." After ensuring that neither man would be following them, removing weapons, tending wounds enough to prevent death but not escape, and taking their horses, Nathan led Dahlia to where he'd left his own mounts. "We can't go back to the ranch," he told her as he helped her into the saddle. "Not yet, they'll be watching for us there."
Where then?
She asked, exhaustion evident in her voice. "I have a friend with a place near the Idaho border. He owes me a favor too." Nathan mounted his own horse. "We'll rest there while I figure out how to clear your name."
My name can't be cleared, Nathan, Dahlia said quietly.
"Not without proof of what George did, and that's locked in his safe in St. Louis." "Then we'll get it," he replied simply, as if suggesting nothing more complicated than a trip to town for supplies. Dahlia stared at him in the moonlight, her expression caught between hope and disbelief. "You do that, risk everything."
Nathan reached across the space between their horses to take her hand. "For you."
"Yes." The certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. Dahlia's fingers tightened around his, and in that moment something final and irrevocable passed between them, a promise more binding than any words. 3 weeks later, Nathan stood in the shadows of a St. Louis alley, watching the rear entrance of the Valmont mansion. The journey east had been swift and cautious, traveling by night when possible, avoiding towns where news of a reward might spark recognition. Dahlia waited at a small boarding house run by the widow of an army friend, the only person in St. Louis Nathan felt they could trust. The plan was simple in theory, though dangerous in execution. Retrieve the original will from George Valmont's safe, along with any other evidence of his theft, then present it to a judge with enough integrity to recognize the truth. Finding such a judge had been Dahlia's task while Nathan reconnoitered the mansion. Through careful inquiries, she'd identified Judge William Harrington, an elderly jurist known for his fairness and immunity to bribery. He presided over a case where a woman sued her guardian for mismanagement of her inheritance, Dahlia had explained. He ruled in her favor despite significant pressure. If anyone will listen, it's him. Now, as midnight approached, Nathan prepared to put their plan into action. The household staff had retired hours ago. Only a single light burned in the study where, according to information gleaned from a talkative housemaid, George Valmont spent most evenings with his ledgers and brandy. Nathan circled to the service entrance, picking the simple lock with tools borrowed from a locksmith who'd owed his father a debt. The hallway beyond was dark and silent. He moved carefully through the kitchen and servants' quarters toward the main part of the house, guided by Dahlia's detailed description of the layout. The study door was ajar, lamplight spilling into the hallway. Nathan paused, listening. The soft scratch of a pen, the clink of glass against wood. Valmont was still awake and working. This complicated matters. The safe was in that very room, hidden behind a painting of Valmont's first wife, Dahlia's mother. Nathan would have to wait or find another way. The decision was made for him when he heard Valmont rise and cross the room. Pressing himself into a shadowed alcove, Nathan watched as the older man emerged, straightening his waistcoat. Valmont was shorter than Nathan had imagined, with thinning hair and cold eyes. He moved with the confident stride of a man accustomed to deference, heading toward the stairs that led to the bedrooms above. Nathan waited until Valmont's footsteps faded, then slipped into the study. The painting was exactly where Dahlia had described, a portrait of a woman with Dahlia's golden hair and gentle smile. Behind it, as promised, was a wall safe. The combination had been the most challenging part of their plan. Dahlia had racked her memory for anything that might serve as Valmont's code, finally recalling that he always used his first wife's birthday for important numbers, a twisted sentimentality that Dahlia found repugnant. Nathan turned the dial carefully, 10:15:43. The safe opened with a soft click. Inside were stacks of papers, jewelry boxes, and several sealed envelopes. Nathan worked quickly, scanning documents by the light of the desk lamp. He found the will almost immediately, its legal language unmistakable. There was also a letter from Dahlia's mother to her daughter, intended to be delivered after her death, which Valmont had clearly intercepted. Most damning of all was a ledger documenting Valmont's systematic theft of Dahlia's inheritance, moving funds from her accounts to his own, selling her mother's property and pocketing the proceeds. The evidence was comprehensive and conclusive. Nathan was gathering these documents when he heard a sharp intake of breath behind him. "I must say this is unexpected," George Valmont said, his voice cold and controlled. "I assumed it would be my stepdaughter attempting this rather amateur burglary, not some hired thug." Nathan turned slowly, careful to keep his hands visible and away from his concealed revolver. Valmont stood in the doorway, a small derringer pointed steadily at Nathan's chest. "Not a thug," Nathan replied calmly, "just someone who recognizes theft when he sees it." Valmont's eyebrows rose slightly. "Ah. You're the rancher she's been hiding with. How industrious of her to find a champion so quickly." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid your noble gesture is wasted. Those documents won't help you." "My influence extends far beyond St. Louis." "Far enough to reach Judge Harrington?" Nathan asked. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Valmont's face. "Harrington is an old fool clinging to outdated notions of justice." "Seems to me those notions aren't so outdated," Nathan replied. "Stealing from your stepdaughter, falsifying a will, threatening to have her committed when she discovered the truth, those have always been crimes, Mr. Valmont." "Crimes require proof and witnesses," Valmont sneered. "Neither of which will exist once I've dealt with you and that ungrateful girl." He gestured with the derringer, "Move away from the safe," slowly. Nathan complied, mind racing. The small gun contained only 2 shots, but at this range they would be fatal. He needed to create an opening. "She told me how her mother died," he said, watching Valmont's reaction carefully. "Wasting illness, the doctors claimed, started just after she changed her will to favor you. Convenient timing." Anger flashed across Valmont's features. "You dare suggest—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Nathan interrupted. "Just noting that Judge Harrington might find it interesting enough to order an exhumation and examination." Valmont's hand trembled slightly. "You know nothing about Elizabeth's death." "I know a guilty man when I see one," Nathan replied. "I've known a few." The distraction worked. Valmont's focus wavered just enough for Nathan to lunge forward, deflecting the derringer as it discharged. The bullet grazed his shoulder instead of finding his heart. Before Valmont could fire again, Nathan had him pinned against the wall, the gun clattering to the floor. "You're making a terrible mistake," Valmont gasped as Nathan's forearm pressed against his throat. "I have powerful friends. The law will hunt you to the ends of the earth." "The law should be interested in this," Nathan replied, releasing pressure just enough for Valmont to breathe while retrieving the fallen derringer. "And in these," he gestured to the documents from the safe now scattered across the desk. A new voice spoke from the doorway. "Indeed we are, Mr. Vance." Nathan turned to find a distinguished older man in a rumpled suit standing there, flanked by 2 uniformed policemen. Judge William Harrington adjusted his spectacles as he surveyed the scene. "It seems Miss Vickers's suspicions were well-founded," the judge continued. "When she came to me with her story this afternoon, I found it troubling enough to warrant observation of this house tonight." He nodded toward the documents. "May I?" Still keeping Valmont covered with the derringer, Nathan stepped aside as the judge examined the will and ledger. "Most illuminating," Harrington murmured. "Officers, please take Mr. Valmont into custody. Charges will include theft, fraud, and attempted murder, for starters." As the police led a protesting Valmont away, Judge Harrington turned to Nathan. "Miss Vickers is waiting at my home with my wife. I suggest you join her there once that shoulder has been seen to. We have much to discuss regarding the restoration of her property." Nathan nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Your Honor." "For believing her when no one else would." The judge's expression softened slightly. Justice may sometimes be slow, Mr. Vance, but in my courtroom at least it remains blind to wealth and influence. He glanced at the portrait of Dahlia's mother. Elizabeth Vickers was a friend of my late sister. I've had suspicions about Valmont for years, but lacked evidence to act. You and Miss Vickers have provided what I needed. Spring had fully arrived in Montana territory by the time Nathan and Dahlia returned to Broken Arrow. The new barn was nearly complete, thanks to neighbors who'd rallied to help rebuild after hearing of the injustice Dahlia had faced. Marshal Thornton, thoroughly disgraced when his corruption was exposed, had been replaced by a former army captain with a reputation for incorruptibility. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the ranch, Dahlia reined her horse to a stop beside Nathan's. Her inheritance restored and her name cleared, she was no longer a fugitive but a woman of independent means. She could go anywhere, do anything. It looks different, she said, gazing at the ranch below, greener than when I left. Spring changes everything, Nathan replied, watching her rather than the landscape, during their journey back from St. Louis. A question had been forming in his mind, but the right moment had never seemed to arrive. Dahlia turned to find him studying her. What is it? I've been thinking about what happens next, he said carefully. For you, I mean. She tilted her head slightly. Only for me. Not for us. The word us sent hope surging through him. You have choices now, freedom, your inheritance. And you think that changes what I want? A smile played at the corners of her mouth. Doesn't it? Dahlia urged her horse closer to his. What I want, Nathan Vance, is to never spend another winter alone, not because I can't survive it, but because I don't want to. Her blue eyes held his steadily. What do you want? The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Nathan had spent 3 years believing that isolation was the price of survival on the frontier. That love was a luxury the West couldn't afford. Dahlia had shown him otherwise, that even in the harshest landscape, connection wasn't weakness but strength. I want you to stay, he said simply, not as a guest, as my wife. Yes, she answered without hesitation, her face illuminated with joy. Yes. They were married 2 weeks later in the newly rebuilt barn, decorated with spring wildflowers and attended by every rancher and settler within 30 miles. Judge Harrington, who had business in Helena, made a special trip to perform the ceremony. As they exchanged vows, Nathan thought of all the winters ahead, no longer seasons to be endured alone, but shared with the woman who had taught him that survival meant nothing without someone to survive for. Later that night, as they stood on the porch of their cabin watching stars emerge above the rolling plains, Dahlia leaned against his shoulder. Do you remember the first thing I ever said to you? Please, I have nowhere else to go, he quoted, his arm tightening around her waist. She shook her head, smiling. After that, when you said I couldn't survive a Montana winter alone. Nathan remembered then her desperation, his impulsive offer, the moment that had changed everything. You said you couldn't survive another winter alone. And you reached for my hand, Dahlia finished softly. You saved me that day, though neither of us knew it yet. We saved each other, he corrected gently, turning to face her. And we'll keep doing that every winter, every spring, every day in between for as long as we have. Her answer was a kiss, warm and certain as a promise, beneath the vast Montana sky that no longer seemed quite so unforgiving.